My name is Margaret Klein. I raised a son who used to hold my hand when he was scared of thunderstorms, who cried in my lap the first time his heart got broken. And yet, somehow, on this particular May morning, the only thing echoing through my quiet little house was silence. Not a phone call, not a card, just the ticking of the kitchen clock, reminding me I was no longer seen as a mother, only as a memory with legs. And if you've ever loved someone who forgot everything you gave up for them, you'll want to stay for this revenge story. The morning sun spilled through the front porch like warm tea over old wood. My knees crackled as I stepped outside with my mug of chamomile, careful not to spill. The rhododendrons I'd planted 2 springs ago were blooming nicely this year, even without much rain. It's funny how flowers keep showing up, even when people don't. I'd been living alone in this modest Portland cottage for the past 15 years. My husband, Harold, had passed in 2008. Stroke. Quick and unfair. We'd built a quiet life together, me as a second-grade teacher, him a mail carrier. Nothing flashy. But we made it work. We paid off this house early, saved enough to send our son Zachary to college without loans. I used to think that counted for something. Zachary had always been a bright kid, even charming when he wanted to be. He drew up house plans on napkins at the kitchen table before he hit high school. I remember he told his 6th-grade teacher he was going to build houses for important people. And now, well, he was one of those important people himself, or at least that's what the magazine said. Owner of his own design firm downtown, married a publicist, drove a car with doors that opened upward. I was proud of him. I still am, in some buried corner of my heart. But if I'm honest, the Zachary I see now is more polished than present. He calls maybe once every few months, sends flowers through assistants. No handwritten notes. No, "Hey Ma, how's your back?" Last month, I sent him a voicemail after my knee gave out while I was hauling mulch out back. Didn't even get a text in return. And yet, this week, out of the blue, he called. "Ma," he said, voice brisk like he was ordering coffee, "I want you to come to our place on Sunday. We're hosting something for Mother's Day." "Really?" I blinked, heart thudding stupidly. "That's thoughtful, Zach." Yeah, it's low-key. Couple friends. You'll like it." Before I could ask anything more, he hung up. But for the next 4 days, I let myself feel something I hadn't in a long time. Anticipation. I ironed my favorite lavender blouse, the one Harold always said made my eyes look alive. I baked lemon squares from the same recipe I used for Zachary's school bake sales, and I wrapped up a small gift for Lily, my granddaughter, a delicate gold chain that had belonged to my own mother. I figured maybe, just maybe, this would be a proper family day. Something tender, something new. The morning of Mother's Day, I woke before the sun. I couldn't sleep. My hands were shaking as I packed the cookies into a tin. I kept checking the mirror to make sure my hair didn't frizz. It felt ridiculous, like a girl before her first dance. But when your child rarely invites you into their life, even crumbs start to look like cake. When I arrived at their mansion, really. I paused at the gate. The place was massive. Sleek lines, spotless lawn, a Tesla in the driveway. I blinked at it like it was a showroom. But my name was on part of this. I had put in $200,000 to help Zachary secure the down payment when the market was brutal. At the time, he had just lost a major client and was terrified the dream would die. I dipped into the savings Harold left me and handed it over without blinking. "You're always my rock, Ma," he had said back then, hugging me like the boy I remembered. But that was the last time he'd said anything close to thank you. Now I stood outside the iron door, unsure whether to knock or just walk in. A young woman I didn't recognize opened it before I could decide. "Food goes around the back," she said flatly, barely making eye contact. "I'm Zachary's caterer?" she asked. "No, I'm his mother." Her face froze for a split second before she mumbled something like, "Oh, okay," and disappeared. I stepped inside alone. The house smelled like rosemary and white wine. Dozens of people I didn't know milled about with glasses and fancy shoes. Music played softly. Everyone seemed busy congratulating Zach on some new project, shaking hands, laughing too loudly. No one looked for me. No sign of Lily, no hug, no Happy Mother's Day. I stood at the edge of the kitchen and waited. No one noticed. So I started to help, out of habit. Refilled the charcuterie board, took out trash, stacked empty glasses. Maybe it was my teacher brain. Maybe it was my mother heart. Or maybe I'd just gotten used to blending in, to being useful instead of being loved. But that was the last time. That was the last Sunday I showed up expecting to be seen. And if Zachary thought I would walk away quietly this time, he had no idea what I still had the power to take back. Monday passed without much thought. I watered my plants, clipped the dead leaves off the hydrangeas. Tuesday came and went with the sound of an audiobook playing through my kitchen window. But Wednesday, that's when the phone rang. It was Zachary. I recognized his name immediately, but not the tone of his voice. "Hey, Ma," he said quickly, like he was fitting me between meetings. "We're doing a small thing on Sunday, Mother's Day. You should come." For a moment, I forgot how to speak. "You're having something for Mother's Day?" "Yeah, a little get-together, some people from work, a few friends. It'd be good if you stopped by." I stood still, my fingers gripping the edge of the sink. "Zach, that sounds lovely. Cool. Just don't bring anything. I'll text you the address." Then he hung up. I stared at the phone for a full minute after the call ended. The screen had gone black, but something inside me had lit up, cautious but hopeful. He wanted me there. He wanted me to be part of something. Even if it wasn't just about me, at least I was invited. That night, I pulled out an old photo album. I hadn't looked at it in years. Zachary at 6, grinning with frosting all over his cheeks. At 12, holding his science fair trophy. At 17, standing next to me in his graduation gown, arms thrown around my shoulders like he actually liked me. Where did that boy go? But I didn't let my thoughts spiral. Not this time. Instead, I focused on the small flicker of warmth I felt. Maybe he was finally seeing me again. By Thursday, I was planning what to wear. Not that I cared much for fashion anymore, but I wanted to look like someone worth remembering. I chose a soft blue blouse. Harold used to say brought out the gray in my eyes in a good way. I set aside a pair of pearl earrings I hadn't worn since Lily's 2nd birthday. Speaking of Lily, she hadn't called in a while either, but she was a teenager now. I tried not to take it personally. Still, I wrapped up the little gold chain with her name on a card, just in case I saw her. Saturday morning, I stood in front of the mirror holding that chain, wondering, when was the last time someone gave me a gift just because I existed? And I want to ask those of you watching, have you ever gone somewhere hoping, really hoping it might be different this time? That maybe, finally, they'll see what you've done for them? Let me know if you have. Because I want to know I'm not alone in this. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about what the party would look like. I imagined Zach introducing me proudly, maybe even giving a short toast. "This is my mother, Margaret. She raised me, supported me through thick and thin. I wouldn't be here without her." I smiled just thinking about it. I even practiced a little response in the mirror. But Sunday morning came with clouds in my stomach. Not dread exactly, just a low, nervous hum. I told myself it was just excitement. I wanted to believe that. I drove over slowly, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. When I reached the house, I paused in the driveway. It wasn't my first time there, but it still didn't feel familiar. The hedges were trimmed to perfection, the windows spotless. The kind of house you'd see in a brochure. I took a deep breath and grabbed my small bag, holding the gift for Lily and a tin of cookies I baked anyway, even though Zach said not to bring anything. When I rang the bell, a young woman opened the door. I didn't recognize her. "You must be the caterer," she said brightly. I blinked. I'm Zach's mother." Her smile froze. "Oh, sorry, come in." I stepped into the house, and the scent of garlic and wine hit me first. The second thing I noticed was the number of strangers. At least 30 people, maybe more. Men in sports coats, women in heels too tall for standing. Everyone looked polished, and no one looked my way. There wasn't a Happy Mother's Day waiting for me. Zach walked by once, carrying a glass of wine, talking to someone about a new real estate venture. He caught my eye for half a second, nodded briefly, and kept walking. I stood there with my cookies in hand, unsure where to put them. A waiter brushed past me and took them without a word. I wandered into the kitchen and found a woman with a clipboard barking orders. I thought about sitting down for a moment, but all the chairs were taken, or stacked against a wall. I didn't want to be in the way, so I hovered. 10 minutes turned into 20, then 40. No one spoke to me. And Zach? He never even introduced me. He never once said, "This is my mother." Not even to Lily, who arrived halfway through, kissed her dad on the cheek, and then floated off to the other side of the room without seeing me. Eventually, someone handed me a tray of napkins and asked if I could pass them out. And like a fool, I did. Because what else do you do when you're a mother who just wants to be close to her son? You serve. The party kept moving without me, like a train that never once slowed down for someone left at the station. Somewhere between the second glass of wine I poured myself and the third tray of hors d'oeuvres I passed out, I realized something painful. No one knew I was his mother. Not a single guest, despite my age, despite my presence in the kitchen, despite the way I quietly smiled and nodded at anyone who glanced my way, had asked, "Oh, are you Zachary's mom?" They assumed I was staff, help, a kind of leftover, someone who didn't belong but wasn't offensive enough to ask to leave. And Zach? He never corrected them. He never looked my way for more than a second. He never said, "Mom, come join us." He never pulled me into a conversation or even acknowledged me beyond that first head nod when I walked in. I watched him clink glasses with a man from the city council. I heard him boast about the upcoming showroom downtown. He said things like, "We've worked so hard to build this life, and Samantha's been my rock through every phase." My name didn't come up once. No mention of how I dipped into Harold's life insurance to pay for his design school tuition. No word about the hours I worked tutoring after retirement so he wouldn't need to take a student loan. No acknowledgement that the very house he was standing in, the one impressing his investors and new friends, existed because I drained my savings to help him buy it during the housing crisis. All I heard was a carefully crafted narrative about self-made success. I stood near the kitchen archway, watching him charm the room, and I felt something hollow open inside me. It wasn't quite anger, not yet. It was a deeper kind of hurt, the kind you don't scream about, the kind that just folds itself into the corners of your soul and sits there. At one point, Lily brushed past me. I reached out and gently touched her arm. "Hi, sweetie." She turned, confused. "Oh, hi," she said, then glanced around like she wasn't sure if we were supposed to be talking. "I brought you something," I said softly, handing her the small velvet pouch. "It was your great-grandmother's." Lily took it but didn't open it. "Thanks," she mumbled, then tucked it into her purse without even a smile. I wanted to believe she was just distracted, that teenagers are awkward, that maybe she'd come around later, but something in her face, it looked trained, like she'd been told not to get too close. I lingered for a while longer. I stacked dishes. I refilled napkin holders. Eventually, someone told me the bathrooms were out of hand towels, so I folded some and set them out without being asked. I became invisible by being useful, and in a strange, twisted way that felt familiar. It reminded me of all the years I packed Zachary's lunches with tiny notes inside, never expecting thanks. Of the late nights sewing his Halloween costumes when I could have just bought one. Of the time I lied to the electric company about my own bills so I could send him emergency rent money. Mothers give. We give without keeping score. But that doesn't mean we forget. By the time the party began to wind down, my legs were sore from standing. I took off my shoes and sat on a bench in the hallway, hoping no one would notice me resting. I heard laughter in the living room as dessert was served. I never got a slice. Zach passed by once more. He paused just long enough to say, "Thanks for helping, Ma. You're a lifesaver." It didn't sting because it was casual. It stung because that was all I got. Not, "I'm glad you came," not "Happy Mother's Day," not even a goodbye. Just, "You're a lifesaver." Like I was a temp hired last minute. I left without anyone seeing me go. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't wait for a ride. I just walked out the side gate, my cardigan pulled tight against the cool spring air, the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter still echoing behind me. The ride home was quiet, too quiet. When I got in, I took off my earrings, placed them gently in a dish, and sat on the edge of my bed. I stared at the photo of Harold on my nightstand. He was smiling in it, holding Zachary as a toddler. "I don't know what happened," I whispered to the room. "I don't know how we got here." But the room had no answers, only silence. That night, I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't tear up the party invitation or throw away the pictures. I just sat still and tried to remember the last time I'd felt like someone's mother. Not their maid, not their wallet, not their afterthought, but their mother. And I couldn't remember. The Monday after the party, I moved slower than usual. Not because of my knees, they always ached, but because something inside me had gone heavy. It was the kind of weight that doesn't just settle on your shoulders, but in your bones. You start to carry silence, like it's part of your body. I sat at the kitchen table, still in my robe, tea gone cold beside me, staring out the window without really seeing the yard. The rhododendrons were still blooming, their purple faces catching the morning sun, but I didn't feel any warmth in return. On the counter sat the gift I had given Lily. She had forgotten it. Or maybe she left it on purpose. Either way, I found it in a pile of napkins someone had dumped into a trash bag and left in Zachary's foyer. I pulled it out on my way out the door, brushed the crumbs off the velvet pouch, and held on to it like it meant something. That gold chain had belonged to my mother. She wore it on her wedding day, then tucked it into a little linen pouch with a handwritten note for me. "Give this to your daughter or your granddaughter when you feel she needs a reminder of where she comes from." And I thought, Lily was ready. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'd been wrong about a lot of things. I sat there holding that pouch, and for the first time in years, I let myself be honest. I wasn't invited to that party because I was a mother. I was invited because someone needed help behind the scenes. I wasn't brought into Zachary's life as family. I was tolerated, like furniture that's too expensive to throw away but too old to really use. And the more I looked back, the more I realized how many little slights I had brushed off. When he called me Margaret instead of Mom in front of his clients. When he said I was staying with them for a bit, even though I was only visiting for a weekend. When Lily's school projects had photos of her parents, her other grandmother, but not me. I had made 1,000 excuses for him. He's busy. He's under pressure. He doesn't mean it that way. But the truth sat in my chest like a stone. He didn't value me because he never learned how, because I never made him, because every time I gave, without asking for anything in return, I was teaching him that I didn't need to be honored, that I didn't expect gratitude, that love could be one-sided and I'd still show up. I had raised a boy who believed my sacrifices were disposable, and I had allowed it. That was the moment the fog in my head began to lift. I stood up, poured the cold tea down the sink, and walked to the drawer by the fridge where I kept the old manila folders. One of them was labeled in Harold's handwriting, House, Deed plus Agreement. It was all still there. The letter from the bank, the title transfer, the clause I had insisted on at the time, just a small thing, buried in the legalese. A fallback in case of financial instability, it allowed me to reclaim the deed if Zach failed to pay property taxes for 6 consecutive months. I remember insisting on it because Harold's voice echoed in my head back then. "Always keep your hand on one corner of the rug, Margaret, just in case they try to yank it." And now, there it was. That small corner, still in my hand. I checked the county tax site. Zach had missed payments, twice. One more lapse, and that clause would be triggered. And here's the strange thing. I didn't feel vindictive. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt awake. Like I had been walking around in someone else's story for years. And suddenly, I remembered that I was allowed to write my own ending. So I made an appointment with a real estate attorney, just to ask some questions. Quietly, without fuss. I stopped baking on Sundays. I stopped checking my phone, hoping for texts that wouldn't come. I didn't block Zach's number or write any dramatic letters. I just started pulling my spirit back from the places I had left it behind. Bit by bit, I collected myself. I found an old piano sheet from when I used to teach music at the elementary school. I hadn't touched the keys in years. My fingers were stiff, but they still remembered. And I played. I found a copy of a local gardening newsletter and submitted a tip about hydrangea trimming. They published it. I cut it out and pinned it on my fridge like a child would a good grade. I started walking again, a few blocks at first, then more. I even visited the senior center on Maple and joined a knitting group. I didn't tell anyone about Zach or the party or the gift. I just laughed at their jokes and let them show me how to fix a loose stitch. That week, I began to feel like a person again. Not a title, not a mother, just Margaret. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first time I truly liked her. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. Not the knitting group, not my neighbor Helen, who always asked too many questions. Not even the lawyer I eventually hired, not at first. I just told him I had some paperwork that might need clarification. But deep down, I knew exactly what I was doing. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't trying to hurt Zachary. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was just done pretending. Done pretending I was okay with being erased. Done pretending the house I helped pay for wasn't mine in some small, legal, undeniable way. The day I walked into the county clerk's office with that thick folder under my arm, the air smelled like dust and dried out ink. I waited behind a man arguing over a zoning issue and a woman trying to correct her name on a marriage certificate. No one looked at me like I was a threat. I just looked like somebody's grandmother taking care of boring life errands. And that's exactly how I wanted it. By the time I reached the front of the line, my hands were steady. "Ma'am, you're eligible to file a deed reclamation based on this clause," the clerk said after reviewing the documents. "Your name can be reinstated as primary title holder in 30 days, pending notice and no contest from the secondary party." I nodded. "I'd like to proceed." "Will you be contacting the other party?" I smiled softly. "No, I'll let the paperwork do that." A week later, the notice was mailed to Zach's address, and just like that, the quiet wheels of change began to turn. In the meantime, I didn't wait around. I cleared out my storage room, finally threw away the old car seat Zach left behind after Lily turned 6. I donated his high school trophies. I kept a few pictures, but I didn't frame them again. I tucked them into a box labeled before. I repotted my plants, started baking again, but this time for myself. I made lemon scones and ate them with fresh cream on a sunny Tuesday morning while listening to old Motown records on my living room radio. And I danced. Not a big, dramatic dance. Just a little swaying in the kitchen while the oven warmed the room. It felt silly and beautiful all at once. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to call. I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't refreshing my inbox, hoping Zach or Lily would remember I existed. I existed anyway. One day, the woman from the county office called. "Just letting you know, there's been no response to the notice. You'll officially regain primary deed ownership next week." I thanked her, politely, then hung up and stared at the kitchen wall for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I just breathed. It felt like something had come full circle, not in a loud, triumphant way, but in the quiet hum of a door closing behind you. I hadn't taken back the house to evict anyone. I had done it to remind myself that I still had power, that I still mattered in some legal, tangible, undeniable way. Of course, the consequences were coming. I knew Zach would find out. I imagined the voicemail, maybe angry, maybe confused, maybe begging. But I wasn't going to prepare for it. I had spent too many years preparing myself for disappointments I didn't deserve. Now, I let life come to me. And that's when something unexpected happened. A woman named Tara, one of the paralegals from the lawyer's office, stopped by my house to drop off some final paperwork. She was in her 40s, wore bright pink glasses, and had a messy bun that kept falling into her eyes. "You know," she said while flipping through the pages, "we don't see many people like you, quiet, determined, and not out for blood." I smiled. I'm just out for peace. She looked up. It shows. And if I may say, I hope when I'm your age, I have your kind of strength. That surprised me. Not because it was kind, but because it was the first time in years someone looked at me and saw strength, not sacrifice. That night, I wrote in my journal again, just a few lines. I didn't ask for recognition, but I won't accept erasure either. This is my quiet return, and I don't need applause for it. Zach still hadn't called. Part of me thought he might show up, knock on my door, demand an explanation or offer an apology wrapped in excuses. But the days passed and nothing came. It was strangely freeing. I stood on my porch, watched the hydrangeas bloom again, and felt no bitterness in my chest. Just a quiet pride. I hadn't burned the house down. I had simply turned the lock and reminded myself, I built the damn door. It was nearly 6 weeks after I reclaimed the house when the knock came. Not loud, just a soft, uncertain knock. The kind a child might make when they were not sure if they're welcome. I opened the door and there he was. Zachary. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he was still over 6 feet. But something in his eyes had shrunk. The confidence, the cocky smoothness he used at the party, it was gone. In its place was a quiet tension, like he'd rehearsed 100 versions of this moment, and none of them felt right. "Hi, Ma," he said, voice dry. I didn't answer at first, just held the door open and let the silence do the talking. He stepped inside, glanced around like it was the first time he'd really seen the house. His gaze lingered on the piano, on the framed picture of Harold I'd returned to the mantel, on the lemon scones cooling in the kitchen. He smelled home, but for the first time, it didn't belong to him. I got the letter," he began, hands fidgeting. "About the deed." I nodded once. It was legal and fair. He nodded too, but it wasn't agreement. It was surrender. "I should have called sooner," he said. I didn't know what to say." I let him sit in the quiet for a while. It was amazing how much power silence held when you weren't afraid to use it. "I didn't realize how much I've taken," he finally said, staring at the floor. "From you, over the years." Now that made me laugh, just a little, soft and bitter. "You didn't take anything, Zach. I gave it. Freely. That was the mistake." He looked up sharply. "It wasn't a mistake. What you did for me, I never said thank you. I didn't show it." "No," I said gently. "You erased it." That word hung between us, and I could see it land. He wanted to argue. I saw it in the flicker of his mouth. But instead, he nodded again. This time slower, accepting. "I guess I thought you'd always be there," he murmured. "In the background, holding things together. That's what mothers do, right?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Hold everything, until our hands bleed." He blinked, and I wasn't sure if it was guilt or grief that showed up on his face. Maybe both. "I've moved out," he said, almost too quietly. "I didn't want to fight you over it. I just packed my things and left." I nodded. That was the right choice. There was a long pause. Then he asked, "So, where do we go from here?" And I said truthfully, "I don't know." Because I didn't. Because after years of being invisible, it takes time to learn how to be seen again, on your own terms. He stood, gave one last look around, then reached into his pocket and handed me something. It was a photo. Old, faded. Me holding baby Zach in my lap, both of us covered in flour, laughing like the world was simple. "I found this in a box you left at the old house," he said. It reminded me. I took it, stared at it, then placed it on the kitchen counter without a word. "I'll go," he said, turning to the door. I didn't stop him. I didn't hug him. I didn't say, "I love you." But I also didn't slam the door. And maybe that's what growth looks like. Quiet, soft, unresolved, but real. That night, I sat with a cup of tea on my front porch. The sky was fading into lavender. The hydrangeas had fully bloomed, wide and blue like summer secrets. I thought of all the years I'd given, all the parts of myself I'd let go of to lift someone else higher. And I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. And I want to ask you, yes, you watching right now, have you ever let go of something not to punish them, but to finally heal yourself? If you have, tell me. I want to know, because healing in silence is powerful, but knowing you're not alone, that's even stronger. Later that week, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but I recognized Lily's handwriting. Inside was a simple card, just 5 words. I'm sorry I forgot you. No explanation, no signature. But it broke me anyway. Not in the way you think. It didn't reopen wounds, it closed them. Because even if it was just a moment, someone had remembered, and that, in the end, was all I ever needed. Not an apology with flowers, not a public speech, just recognition. Quiet, real. And now this house? It's not just mine on paper, it's mine in presence, in peace, in proof that I was always here, even when no one looked my way. The quiet didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. At first, it felt like something missing. The absence of footsteps, the lack of dishes in the sink, no thud of Zach's boots by the front door, no blare of the TV in the living room, just silence, stretching itself across the rooms like a soft blanket. But slowly, I stopped missing the noise. Instead, I began to notice the little things, the things that had always been there, waiting for me to come back to them. The tick of the old wall clock in the dining room, the creak in the hallway floor near the guest room, the smell of rosemary by the kitchen window when I opened it at just the right time of day. For so long, I'd kept the house running like a machine. I cleaned, repaired, restocked. But I wasn't really in it. I was always behind someone else, always preparing for their comfort, their needs. Now, for the first time in years, the house felt like mine. I rearranged the furniture, not because I had to, but because I wanted a new view of the garden. I moved the old armchair by the front window, right where the sun hit around 10 a.m. That became my reading spot. I reread the books I used to love, Maya Angelou, Anne Lamott, even a few old cookbooks with scribbled notes in the margins. I found pieces of myself I hadn't spoken to in decades. I also cleaned out the linen closet, found the quilt my mother had sewn by hand, the one I thought was lost during the last move. I laid it across my bed and ran my fingers over the worn patches, each one telling a different part of her story. I wasn't trying to start over. I wasn't chasing a new beginning. I was just living again. The people at the knitting group noticed. Carol said my laugh had changed. Fuller, she called it. I didn't know what that meant, but I liked the sound of it. I even hosted the group at my house one afternoon. Nothing fancy. Just tea, pound cake, and good conversation. No one asked about Zach. No one asked about the party. And I didn't offer. That chapter was closed. Quietly, but completely. A few days later, I received an email from Lily. Short, simple. Hi, Grandma. I've been thinking about you. I miss baking with you. Can I come visit sometime? I stared at that email for a long time before answering. Not because I was unsure of what to say, but because I wanted to feel every ounce of that moment, that recognition, that spark of possible connection. When I finally replied, I wrote, "Yes, sweetie, I'd love that, but you'll need to bring your own apron. Mine's officially retired." She replied with a laughing emoji and 3 hearts. I didn't cry, but my chest felt lighter that day. I made a new rule for myself. I'd only hold space for people who truly saw me, not just needed me. That meant saying no more often, no to favors disguised as obligations, no to guilt-tripped phone calls, no to the version of motherhood that demanded I sacrifice myself endlessly without question. Zach tried to call again once. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. And I was okay with that, because the more I listened to the stillness, the more I realized this wasn't loneliness, it was peace. There's a difference between being alone and being abandoned. Being alone is when you choose solitude. Abandonment is when someone chooses to forget you. I had spent years living in the shadow of the second, and now, finally, I had stepped into the light of the first. I walked more. I planted more. I painted the hallway a soft green that reminded me of the ocean at dawn. I didn't ask for opinions. I didn't post photos. I just did it. For me. And the house responded. It became warmer, more alive. Not because of who lived in it, but because of how I lived in it. One evening, as I watered the plants, a breeze drifted through the open door. I stood still and listened, really listened. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It breathed with me. It pulsed with the hum of a life reclaimed. And in that silence, I heard something powerful. Not applause, not praise, just presence. And that, I realized, was enough. 3 weeks after Zach had walked out of my house and my life, I heard from Carol, my friend from the knitting group. She'd seen something on social media, a post by one of Zach's old business partners. Apparently, the funding he'd been counting on fell through. Something about a real estate investor pulling out at the last minute. His pitch didn't hold up, Carol said, sipping her tea, not quite realizing the weight of her words. Apparently, the investor found out the property he hosted that Mother's Day party at wasn't legally in his name anymore. I didn't say anything right away, not because I felt smug or triumphant, but because I felt sad. Sad that it had to be this way. Sad that it took public embarrassment for him to realize what he had lost, not just in property, but in trust. I remember when Zach used to be proud of his work, when he built things from the ground up, not leaning on other people's names or deeds. But somewhere along the way, success got confused with image, and he stopped caring about the foundation beneath him. Turns out, when the foundation walks away, the whole structure gets shaky. He'd been renting an apartment on the edge of town, I knew that much. Carol said she saw him once at the supermarket, alone, hunched over a grocery cart with a box of frozen waffles and a tired look in his eyes. I almost said hi, she told me, but he didn't look like he wanted to be noticed, and maybe that was the point. People always think the consequence of mistreating someone is a big dramatic scene, a slammed door, a lawsuit, a confrontation. But the real cost is quieter. It creeps in through the cracks. No one trusts you the same way. People stop inviting you to things. Your phone doesn't ring like it used to, and the people who once held you up quietly let go. I hadn't told many people what happened between me and Zach, but people can feel the truth even when you don't say it out loud. And the truth was, he was no longer someone people rallied around. Not because I told them to step back, but because they saw for themselves who he had become. I visited Lily's school recital the following Saturday. She was in the second row playing the violin with a slight frown of concentration on her face. I clapped when it was over, and when she spotted me in the crowd, her face lit up. She ran over and hugged me tight, like she'd been waiting for that moment for weeks. "I made cookies for you," she whispered. "They're a little burnt, though." I laughed and squeezed her tighter. Burnt cookies made with love taste better than perfect ones made out of obligation. She didn't quite get the subtext, but she smiled anyway. Afterward, I saw Zach in the parking lot leaning against his car. He didn't approach, just watched us from a distance, then turned away before I could read his expression. Maybe that was another cost he'd begun to feel, the distance he created but no longer knew how to cross. It's strange. Watching someone you love stand outside the life you built, like seeing a shadow where a person used to be, not because you pushed them out, but because they chose not to stay when it mattered. I sat down that night and wrote something in my journal. You can't measure absence in silence. You measure it in how light your life becomes without the weight they added. The house was still quiet, but it wasn't empty. Friends dropped by more often now. I had standing tea dates with women who knew how to listen and laugh without taking up too much space. I'd signed up for a ceramics class and made a crooked little bowl that I proudly used for sugar cubes. I wasn't alone. I was surrounded by people who saw me. That's the price Zach never calculated. He thought he was just brushing off an old woman. But what he really lost was the kind of love that doesn't need to be earned every day, because it was already paid for in sleepless nights and endless casseroles and prayers whispered over a fevered forehead. Love like that doesn't come around twice. And when you break it, You don't just lose a person, you lose a home, you lose a history, you lose your place in someone's story. Zach had lost all of that, not because I locked him out, but because he stopped knocking. And now, the door is still there. But the key? It's no longer his. It happened in the grocery store of all places. I was standing in the cereal aisle deciding between oat bran and granola when I heard them behind me. 2 women, mothers from Lily's school, I assumed, talking just loud enough for me to hear. Did you hear what she did? Took the house right out from under him. Can you imagine doing that to your own son? She's probably lonely. Bitter old women make the worst decisions. They didn't whisper. They didn't even try to hide the way they looked at me when I turned. I gave them a polite smile, nodded, and walked away with my cart. I didn't pick up either cereal. I just kept walking, straight out the automatic doors and into the quiet of the parking lot. For a few seconds, the sting sat heavy in my chest, not because their words were true, but because they were so easy to believe. People see a woman standing alone and they assume she must have done something wrong. They never stop to wonder how many times she bit her tongue, how many times she made herself small for the sake of peace, how many nights she cried quietly in a bathroom while her family laughed in the living room. I sat in my car, hands on the wheel, but didn't turn the key. Instead, I let myself breathe through it, let the pain rise and pass. No one had defended me. No one had jumped in to correct them. And you know what? That was okay, because I didn't need defending anymore. I used to want someone, anyone, to stand up for me, to say, she gave her whole life to her son. She deserves better. I dreamed about Zach realizing what he'd lost, walking into a room full of people and saying, she built me. Everything I am is because of her. But dreams like that don't keep you warm, and they certainly don't keep you strong. Reality does. Growth does. I turned the key and drove home with nothing in my cart, but I felt full anyway. That night, I called Helen, my neighbor, told her I was thinking of starting a small backyard gardening group, just for fun, nothing official. She lit up. Count me in, and I'll bring Ruth from next door. Her roses are struggling, and she could use the company. And just like that, I was reminded, I may not be defended in public, but I was held in private, and that matters more. A few days later, Lily came to visit. She wore a little floral dress and brought a hand-drawn card that said, "To the bravest grandma I know. We made chocolate chip cookies." She spilled flour all over the floor, and I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. At one point, while licking the spoon, she looked up and asked, "Grandma, are you mad at Daddy?" I paused. "No," I said softly. "I'm just not waiting for him to understand me anymore." She tilted her head like she didn't quite get it, but I could see her tuck it away somewhere deep. One day, she would. Later that night, after I put her to bed in the guest room, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and thought about all the people who had judged me without ever knowing me. It's funny, isn't it? How easily the world forgets a mother's work. They remember the mistakes, they forget the meals, they notice the silence, but not the years of noise made just to keep everyone else whole. So let me ask you something. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like no one stood up for you when they should have, how did you get through it? Did you stay quiet, or did you finally say, "That's enough"? Leave me a comment. I want to hear your story, because silence is only powerful when we choose it, not when it's forced on us. Back inside, I looked at the little card Lily had left on the kitchen table. "To the bravest grandma I know." It sat beside the sugar bowl under the soft kitchen light, and I realized that was the only kind of validation I needed now. Not applause from strangers, not defense from cowards. Just a reminder that someone saw me and thought, she stood tall even when no one stood with her. And that, to me, was enough. It was a Sunday afternoon in late spring, the kind of afternoon where the air is soft and everything feels like it's settling into place. I was outside trimming the hydrangeas when I heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. I looked up and saw Lily. No warning, no text, no phone call, just her standing there in her little white sneakers, holding a brown paper bag like it was something sacred. "Hi, Grandma," she said. Her voice was small, a little breathless from the walk, I wiped my hands on my apron and smiled. "Hey, baby, come on in." We sat at the kitchen table. She unpacked the bag, 2 blueberry muffins, still warm, and a tiny glass jar of jam she said she made herself in home economics class. "I know it's not as good as yours," she said quickly, "but I wanted you to have it." I opened the jar, spread a little on the muffin, and took a bite. It was tart, a little too much lemon, but honest. Like her. "It's perfect," I said, and I meant it. We talked about school, her violin recital, the fact that she'd just learned how to use a sewing machine and nearly stitched her finger. But then, as I poured us each a cup of tea, she asked, "Do you ever miss Daddy?" It wasn't an accusation, just a question. I took a moment before answering. "I miss the version of him that used to sit with me on the porch and ask about the stars, the version that held my hand when we crossed the street. That version, I miss him all the time." She nodded, like she understood more than she let on. "I think he misses you too," she said. "He just doesn't know how to say it." I smiled gently. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. We sat quietly for a while, the kind of quiet that's not awkward but soft, full of things that don't need to be said. Then Lily stood up, walked over to the bookshelf, and picked up an old photo frame, one I hadn't looked at in months. It was of me, Zach, and Harold at Lily's 3rd birthday party. I was holding the cake. Zach was trying to swipe a finger of frosting. Harold had his arm around both of us. "Mom talks about you, you know," she said. "Not in a mean way. She says she didn't expect you to actually take the house back." That made me chuckle. Neither did I, to be honest. "She said you changed," Lily added. I looked her straight in the eyes and replied, "No, sweetie. I just stopped letting people pretend I didn't matter." She didn't say anything, but her eyes welled up a little. She put the photo frame back gently, like it was something fragile. Before she left that day, she hugged me longer than usual, tighter, and just as she reached the door, she turned and said, "I'm really glad you're still here. It hit me harder than I expected." She didn't mean just physically. She meant present, seen, whole. After she left, I sat with her teacup still warm across from me. I watched the way the afternoon light touched the table, the way the wind moved through the open window. And I thought, she sees me. Maybe not with big words. Maybe not with some grand apology on behalf of her father, but she sees me now. And sometimes that's more than enough. Because the goal was never revenge. It was never to make anyone pay. It was simply to exist fully, to no longer be background noise in the story of a son who had forgotten the verses written by his own mother's hands. I think that's what a real revenge story is. Not fire and fury, but silence and dignity, stillness that no longer asks for recognition but quietly earns it anyway. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt someone notice you again after they spent years overlooking you? Did it come with an apology or just a look, a word, a moment that told you you were never invisible? If that happened to you, I'd love to hear about it, because those are the moments we carry, the ones that make the pain worth surviving. That evening, I pulled out a box of Lily's old drawings. I found one she made in kindergarten. It was a crooked house with a big sun and a stick figure with white hair holding a pie. On top, in shaky purple crayon, she'd written, "My grandma's house is the safest place in the world." And I realized it still is, because this house wasn't just reclaimed in court. It was reclaimed in presence, in love, in being seen again, even if the person who should have seen me first never looked back. She did. And that changed everything. The garden bloomed early that year. It was only mid-May, and already the azaleas were bursting open, pink and stubborn and unapologetically full of life. I took it as a sign. It had been almost 3 months since the Mother's Day party, the one where I'd been told to wear an apron and serve like some background character in my own life. That woman, the one who'd stood in the kitchen while her son played host in a house built by her sacrifices, felt like a shadow now, still real, still painful, but far behind me. I didn't need to win loudly. That wasn't the point anymore. The victory was in how I woke up now, without dread, without needing anyone's approval. I made coffee because I liked the smell, not because I had to serve it to anyone. I took long walks without checking my phone. I stopped waiting for Zach to call, and when he did, once or twice, I let it ring out. Not in anger, in peace. You see, the loud wins, the big showy ones, are for people who still want to prove something. I didn't. My proof was in the life I had rebuilt. Lily came over every Saturday now. We baked, gardened, sometimes just sat on the swing and listened to birds. She brought books from school and read them out loud with that funny little voice she used for different characters. It was the kind of joy that didn't need explanation. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I came across an old shirt of Zach's, faded red, still faintly smelling of cedar and thyme. I paused, held it for a second, then folded it neatly and placed it in a donation box. Letting go doesn't always look like slamming doors. Sometimes it looks like folding fabric with a steady hand and a steady heart. There was a part of me that wondered what people thought. People like those mothers in the grocery store, or distant cousins who saw the news of the deed transfer and quietly picked sides. But then I reminded myself, none of those people had ever folded my laundry at midnight when Zach was sick. None of them had stood at the kitchen sink with their heart breaking, wondering how their own child had learned to look through them. They didn't know my story. They never would, and they didn't need to. I was no longer trying to convince anyone of my worth. That was the real victory. Not Zach's regret, not Emma's silence, not even Lily's love. Though that was the sweetest part of all. It was knowing that I had faced the void, walked through it, and come out whole. My story didn't end with fireworks. It ended with quiet mornings, with tea on the porch and soil under my nails, with the quiet knowledge that I was no longer begging to be seen, and that was enough. A few neighbors began asking if I'd consider hosting a small memoir writing group. "You've lived through something," they said. "People would want to hear it." I smiled. Maybe one day. But for now, my story was still mine, still unfolding, still blooming like those azaleas, too stubborn to wait for summer. The wind picked up slightly that afternoon. I stood barefoot on the porch, a cup of tea in my hand, watching the leaves dance like they knew a secret. And I thought, this is what quiet victory feels like. Not being celebrated, but being undeniably alive. Let me ask you if you've ever found peace after being dismissed, overlooked, or cast aside. Did your healing come with a big moment? Or did it arrive quietly, like sunlight slipping across the floor? If you're here and you've made it this far with me, I want to tell you something. You don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes the quietest survival is the most powerful kind, because when the noise fades and the house is still, what you're left with is yourself. And that is more than enough. There was no final confrontation, no apology from Zach, no letter, no teary phone call asking for forgiveness. And oddly, I didn't need any of it. What I got instead was peace. The kind of peace that comes when you finally stop trying to explain yourself to people who decided long ago not to listen. The kind of peace that blooms in the quiet, when the noise of expectation dies down and you hear your own heart again. I walked through my garden that morning, coffee in hand, and everything felt still, not empty, still. The tomatoes were ripening. The lavender leaned gently with the breeze. Birds moved through the feeder like it was just another day. And in a way, it was. But it was also a day I had earned. Not through revenge, not through shouting or proving anything, but through standing quietly in my own truth. I'd once thought justice meant being understood, being apologized to, having my sacrifices acknowledged in public with loud declarations and a returned seat at the table. But justice never came. What came instead was something softer, wiser, real. I didn't reclaim my place in someone else's house. I reclaimed myself in my own. That is peace. And I would choose it 1,000 times over any hollow justice the world might offer. If you're reading this, if you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, erased, I hope you know this. You don't have to be right in their eyes to live fully in your own. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever found peace where you once searched for justice? What did your healing look like? Share your story with me. Let's remind each other that quiet victories still count. Sometimes they're the only ones that do.